So in this lesson, we're going to be talking about corresponding parts. So using corresponding parts of congruent triangles. So we already learned how to prove triangles' congruence by our shortcut, side, 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 angle, and angle, angle, side. So once we prove that the two triangles are congruent, we can then say that any two corresponding parts, so either two angles or two sides or whatever, are also congruent by the corresponding parts of congruent triangles and congruent. Congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, so we can just label it CPCTC. Okay, so let's look at this proof. So I am given that MN, so this is congruent to MP, so this one, and you can see from the picture that it is given, and also that NO and PO, by the picture also, that those are congruent. So we're trying to prove that angle N and angle P are congruent here. Okay, so we always start with our given, and then we try to get to what we are trying to prove. So that means my prove is down here. So my first step is our given step. By the reflexive property, because reflexive means two things are congruent to each other, I can also say since those two sides are congruent, that means my third side also has to be congruent. So my MO side. Okay, so MO is congruent to MO by the reflexive property. So because we know that side, side, side is one of our shortcuts to prove two triangles congruent, we know that side, side, side makes those congruent. But I'm trying to prove that angle N and angle P are congruent. Well, if they're corresponding angles, which means that they are corresponding in the correct direction in their triangles where they should be matched up, and they are congruent, because side, 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 that means we can do CPCTC to show that those two angles are congruent. So since all of my lines are corresponding, that means all of my angles will correspond and also be congruent. Okay, so we got AB is parallel to DC, and angle B is congruent to angle D. So we start with our given. We know again that this, since they share it, is going to be congruent. So segment AC is congruent to segment CA by the reflexive property. Oops. And then by alternate interior angles, because if we extended our parallel lines here, we could see that those are alternate interior angles of each other. So by alternate interior angles, that means those two lines are congruent, and those two angles are congruent. So angle BAC is congruent to angle DCA because of alternate interior angles. So I'm going to put angle, we said angle BAC is congruent to angle DCA. Okay, so you can see that those are the alternate interior angles right there. And then because we have angle, angle, and our side, we know that those triangles are congruent by angle, angle, side. And we are trying to prove that BC is congruent to DA. And since my two triangles are congruent, that means the two corresponding sides are also congruent. So you can see that these are my corresponding sides because they match up when we said that our triangles were congruent. Okay, so for each pair of triangles, tell why the two triangles are congruent. Give the congruent statement, then list all the other corresponding parts of the triangles that are congruent. Okay, so we know if angle K is being shared by vertical angles, we know that those two are congruent. So we have congruent sides. We also have these two angles being congruent, and then we also just made angle K congruent because of vertical angles. So by angle, angle, side, we know that triangle, let's do HJK, is congruent to triangle MLK. Okay, so this is my congruence statement right here, that the two triangles are congruent. So now I have to list all the corresponding parts of the triangles that are also congruent. So all angles and all sides. So angle J is congruent to angle L, angle K is congruent to angle K, angle H is congruent to angle M. I'm going to erase those so I have room to do the segments now. Okay, so my segments, we got HJ being congruent to ML. Oops. And then we have JK being congruent to KL. So JK is congruent to KL. And then our last one is HK being not parallel, sorry, these are supposed to be congruent, are congruent to MK. So there are my different corresponding angles and corresponding lines. So for each pair of triangles, tell why the two triangles are congruent, give the congruence statement, then list all the corresponding parts of the triangle that are also congruent. Okay, so by the reflexive property, we already have two sides that equal each other, and since RP is shared for both of them, we know by the reflexive property that RP is congruent to PR. So that means triangle RPN is congruent to triangle, match up all your angles here, so RPQ. So now let's label corresponding lengths. So we already got RP right here. So then NP is congruent to RQ. And then we have NR being congruent to PQ. Corresponding angles. Angle N is congruent to angle Q. Angle P is congruent to angle R, because you could see it shares the 3 and the 1, so you have to share the 3 and the 1 to be congruent, so that's angle R there. And then you have your last one, which is angle Q. Oops. So we did Q, R, and P. So there are some congruent angles right there. Okay, so we already started off with our given, so we're going to put our given in here, and we're always ending with what we're trying to prove. So we're trying to prove AZ is congruent to AC. Okay, so now let's see how we get from one to the next. So we have everything marked off. Angle YAZ and angle BAC are vertical angles. Okay, so if they are vertical angles, that means that they are congruent, because all vertical angles are always congruent. So those two angles are congruent. So angle YAZ is congruent to angle BAC because of vertical angles. So then my next step, if I'm trying to get that AZ is congruent to AC, we could say that triangle YZA is congruent to triangle BCA because of angle side angle. So that means all of my corresponding parts should be congruent, so all we have to do is put our little CPTPC in. So we put our little CPCTC in because any corresponding part is now going to be congruent because my two triangles we proved were congruent.